Thank you, Sandra. And it's really fantastic to be here this evening, to be virtually in the National Library, hoping to get back there soon. And particularly because of all the support that I've had from the National Library staff, everyone over many, many years of researching in the library and the archives. And I think I can genuinely say that I couldn't have written Irish writers and the 30s in quite the same way if I didn't have access to the amazing archives at the National Library and the support and help of the fantastically informed staff. And as you've mentioned, also some of the people in the book are minorities. So what the archive represents around Leslie Daiken, who's a Irish Jewish writer, is contributing to a broader idea of our sort of cultural realm. And it's terrific. Our national institution, like the National Library, is supporting that and will continue to do so. So I'm going this evening to talk a little bit about the genesis of the book and how I came to write it. So Irish Writers in the 30s, Art, Exile and War is the full title. And really the sort of trajectory and journey that I've been on for quite some time to exploring both a local community Jewish history and then taking that and seeing where it became and intersected with a global history. So along the way, I became interested in Irish writers and artists in a global context, particularly those who joined international movements as part of a kind of radical cultural, a global diaspora. So I'm looking in particular in Irish writers in the 30s, examining the cultural history of Irish writers in the 30s, who connected to the movements created in reaction to the global crises of the 1930s. Writers who went to aid Spain during the Spanish Civil War, writers who visited the USSR, and Irish writers in London who were part of groups fighting imperialism and interested in new forms of cultural expression as part of a move to egalitarianism and a bigger discussion that was taking place around cultures. Although the book concentrates on the lives of 4 writers in particular, Leslie Daiken, Ewart Milne, poet, Michael Sayers, writer and journalist, and the poet Charles Donnelly, it also encompasses the stories of a broader group within their circle and looks at issues of women writers on the left who may have been connected to the key causes of the decade, such as the Spanish Civil War, and partially the archives for women were a challenge, and to find the sort of depth that I wanted. And that's going to take up another talk on another evening. The book is intended to highlight Irish writers' varied roles in left cultures of the 30s. What type of interpretation did they have of the cultural ideas about popular front cultural aesthetics? And it also, I tried to examine their writings as a kind of witness, of bearing witness. Texts that bore witness to the times were something that interested me. How did Irish writers approach that? And also, where did they fit into a diverse range of radical political and cultural networks in both an Irish radical cultural diaspora as well as connecting with international ones. I'm going to flag up some of the themes of the writing in Leslie Daiken and Michael Sayers' journalism and poetry, and talk a little bit about why I think it's significant to look at their lives and their experience in broadening our concept of Irish cultural history and Irish writers' broader place in a cultural history of English-speaking writers in the 30s. And if I have time, I'll also speak to the archives and how we can create diverse histories and new strands in cultural and social history when we get a breadth of archival source and material. Now, so let's have a look. This is Leslie Daiken at his desk about 1950. He already knew to put all the books behind for a good photograph. Leslie Daiken led me to most of the writers that feature in this book. He was sort of like a literary Pied Piper that led me through to other writers and enabled me to see new connections. He was born in Dublin in 1912 to Samuel and Rosa Daiken, and the family originally there came from Lithuania. But Daiken was born into the community, the Jewish community in Dublin at a time when it was about nearly 5,000 souls. He attended Trinity College, graduating in 1934, and not long after that moved to London, where he lived for most of his life while retaining a real affection for Ireland and links to its cultural scene, returning regularly either to meet up in the Palace Bar with other writers and or holidaying with Cusack and his family. At the time of his death, he was remembered in 1964, he was remembered as a jovial toy man, and his last job was lecturer at the University of Ghana, a job which Conor Cruise O'Brien had gotten for him. He was variously during his life a journalist, broadcaster, educator, filmmaker, poet, and cultural renegade, sometimes having to make do with tourism PR and hack work to keep himself and the family going. He was an expert on toys and games and street crimes. That was true, and that was featured in his obituary. But the focus on those endeavours solely obscured his role in 30s political and cultural circles, his campaigning journalism with small groups of left-wing Republicans as part of Ireland's radical cultural diaspora. And only one obituary made reference to him as a worker in the cultural sphere, hinting at something more complex in his life trajectory. In his tribute to Daiken, Brian O'Neill, Irish Press journalist, observed, "He was always busy, always with a half a dozen irons in the fire, always trying to give a hand to some Irish writer who needed it." Now, so that is summary. I'm going to talk about his friendships there, and later in the talk about Michael Sayers. But I just want to go back, and it's literally at least over 20 years ago, I interviewed Leslie Daiken's brother, Aubrey Daiken. It was for a little an oral history project, or trying to gather information for a little Jewish history project. And at the time of the interview, I was completely struck by Aubrey Daiken's devotion to his brother, and at the same time, his regret that his brother hadn't gotten recognition, talking about his efforts to write the Irish Jewish novel, to gain recognition for a lot of his work on history of lullabies, street rhymes. And that tied into another question that I was fascinated by at the time, as to why there were not more radical Jewish activists in the community. Was there no tradition of radicalism within the Dublin Jewish community? And Daiken seemed like perhaps an unusual representative and a possible lead for some kind of a study, which would have been more local based. Given that the community was small, a regional community, basically at one level, it's not a surprise that there may not have been more radical left-wing adherents. I mean, Manus O'Riordan did indicate and did do pioneering work looking at the Jewish Tailors and Pressers Union, and unearthed the fact that the Labour leader and Easter Rising martyr James Connolly had election material printed in Yiddish, obviously for aimed at workers. These were tantalizing fragments nonetheless. And although there was material in the Jewish Museum, it seemed as if a broader study based on less material was not really a possibility. Now, in 1998, I came across a book by the German academic Gustav Claus about the life of Thomas O'Brien, poet and Spanish Civil War international brigadier. And he argued that Daiken was one within a small group of left-wing poets in the 30s, who, as Claus argued, had been wiped off the literary map. And Claus was the first that I'd come across to highlight and articulate the concept of Irish writers' role in the left cultures of the 30s, to indicate that they might be part of a louder global chorus of writers fighting fascism and seeking new means of egalitarian expression. The British historian of the left, Andy Croft, wrote of the era in 30s Britain. It was a generous moment, a critical and creative intervention that sought to be constructive, to build a broad and popular imaginative and intellectual alliance against unemployment, poverty, bad housing, dangerous working conditions, educational waste, and to isolate the intellectual forces of the enemy. And Daiken and the Irish writers around in his circle and his broader group of friends were also and would become part of that exciting cultural movement in Britain, while sometimes looking for Irish inflected versions, as Daiken did with his anthology Goodbye Twilight, Songs of the Struggle, or attempting different avant-garde forms. But they threw in their artistic lot with a broader cultural movement responding to the tumult and upheaval of the times. As poet Gerald Daw argued in relation to a broader group of poets, of Irish poets in the 30s, the poets who started out in the early 30s went on to probe and explore many different avenues, their language and style challenging what was conventional and orthodox in the poetry of the time. Historian Emmett O'Connor had highlighted Daiken's anthology, which he called of proletarian poetry, that's the Goodbye Twilight, and O'Connor viewed Daiken's book as symbolic in the cultural realm of something of a popular front atmosphere in the early 30s in Ireland. It was O'Connor, the leading Irish Labour historian, who asked me in 2011 to contribute to a collection of essays on Lives of the Left, Studies in Irish Radical Leadership. And by that time, the voluminous Daiken archive was now fully accessible, and so started the real journey. So the archive in the National Library, which had been given by Aubrey Daiken and with some contributions from Daiken's daughter, he had very carefully kept all this and brought it to the National Library. And once I got into the archive, I began to see Daiken not as an isolated Jewish radical or a minority within a minority, but as someone interconnected through to very diverse groups in the British left, Irish Republicans, and a broader group of Irish writers cleaving to anti-fascism and internationalism in the 30s. So mixed with Irish Republicans and British Socialists, became involved in all sorts of radical journalism. And as we'll see later, Michael Sayers became involved in a different type of literary group with T.S. Eliot as his mentor. And you can see here, that's a photograph of Daiken. I don't know that he's attracting a crowd if the crowd are in front of him, speaking at the Hyde Park Corner, famous Speaker's Corner, representing the Irish Republican Congress political group. That's at Trafalgar Square. Daiken has got a little roundy glasses. He's just in beside the woman in the front row. And at the very far left, or to my left, Ewart Milne, who's another of the writers, is there. And you'll see Spanish Republicans. These are just some of the groups that the Irish writers were involved with. Now, scrapbook. Okay, so this is, there are many files within the Daiken papers, but the scrapbook was one that really solidified some of the theories and expanded out the possibilities for what I could write about, because in it, at the beginning were articles on tourism and Ireland and sort of more commercial articles. But as you worked your way through, then finally it came to Daiken's writings in the 30s and 40s, his book reviews, extracts from left-wing literary magazines, educational posters, woodcuts by his friend, the artist Harry Kernoff, all sorts of articles with arguments about proletarian poetry. This is Daiken's review of books, and where he articulates some of his own thoughts on the culture of the 30s, and also reviews some of his own friends in these other British socialist circles. What is reanimated in the pages of the scrapbook is a kind of spectral conversation with a group of other dead writers who seemed intent on debating literary and political dilemmas in the 30s related to culture and ideas about political commitment. So the scrapbook allowed me to not only Daiken's own writings, but also to see those of his friends and associates on the left, and to begin to make a connection, to see this web of connections that Daiken had established and the kinds of writers he was in literary company with. So he is reviewing his own friends' work and also indicating the sort of little radical journals, mosquito journals, trade union journals that he wrote for in the 30s. And he associated with people like Jack Lindsay, who was a British socialist and also a cultural maven, I suppose, who brought Daiken into one of his anthologies. So the Daiken archive, not only, obviously, I was then able to track his correspondence and to see in greater detail who he maintained a correspondence with, but I wouldn't have been able to discover all the different magazines and little known journals that he wrote for if everything wasn't kept, which he had kept, of his own work. An obituary of the writer Michael Sayers in 2010, which I spotted online, seemed to indicate here was another Dublin Jewish writer born 1 year before Leslie Daiken. So he seemed like he could be a candidate for friendship or rivalry. And with a few clicks, I was able to find the email for his son, Sean Sayers, who confirmed that they had indeed been friends and political allies. Now, some of the writers, Jack Lindsay is there. He is someone who Daiken corresponded with and also was included in a radical anthology. That's Nancy Cunard, who published the Irish poet Ewart Milne, and John Lehman also published Ewart Milne, another of Daiken's friends. So these are just some of the cultural outlets they had. Now, Michael Sayers got his hands behind his back there. He came from a more affluent background. He was born in Dublin. His father, Philip Sayers, was a businessman who had a strong Republican sympathies. And in family lore, the family are supposed to have hidden various fugitives on the run, including Michael Collins. And although this seemed like an anecdote, there is some confirmation in military archives that Philip Sayers allowed his house to be open as a refuge. Michael Sayers was educated at Cheltenham College and Trinity College, Dublin, and like Daiken, he encountered Samuel Beckett in Trinity and may have taken some of his classes, although he was registered for philosophy. He was in London from 1930 and wavering between a career in the law and medicine, but he nursed literary ambitions, which himself and Daiken had talked about and written to one another about since their teens. He succeeded, with the help of T.S. Eliot, in getting various cultural assignments, writing drama reviews. He also wrote short stories for the Criterion and the New English Weekly, both publications which were prominent at the time. He moved to America in 1937, first trying radical journalism and training with the theatre producer Norman Bell Geddes. He wrote 3 popular books, very much concerned with Axis infiltration and espionage in the war years, and was doing very well as a pioneer in TV drama with the network NBC, when he was informally blacklisted as a result of some books he'd written in the 40s. He was in exile essentially from the United States until the 1980s, but he continued to write. He had to write under a pseudonym, Michael Connor, writing for TV dramas like The Adventures of Robin Hood. And effectively, his career was very rocky as a result of the blacklisting. So these writers, Michael Sayers, Daiken, Urmel and Donnelly, were a few among thousands of their fellow countrymen and women who had emigrated in the 30s. Their societal status as writers was precarious, but there was some aspects of this change, this exile journey, that were exhilarating. Not least the prospect of joining such a diverse group of political and cultural networks in London and meeting other like souls. But what were their feelings about the Ireland they left behind, or in relationship to their thoughts about being Irish? Daiken and Sayers were situated in the politics and literary culture of the small Irish left of the 30s, Daiken much more so, at a time of great upheaval in post-independence Ireland. And at a time when there was also, as Emmett O'Connor has written about, Red Scares, particularly in the early part of the 30s and later part of the 30s, and an overall climate of distrust of anything socialist or left wing. So they are minorities, both politically and ethnically. In that period when the early 30s in particular, of upheaval in Ireland, marked by violence, clashes between the IRA and the groups that emerged from the Army Comrades Association, the Blue Shirts as they're known. So they are in an Ireland where there's an atmosphere of anti-communism that grew through the decade. And some of this comes from official sources in terms of Department of Justice fearing the IRA could go communistic. So they represent a dissenting voice, if you like, at odds with some of the cultural values, both in their politics and their ideas about writing. The towering geniuses, the writers in exile, Beckett and Joyce, cast a long shadow over other Irish writers. And what you can see from studying this small group is that some Irish writers left to the political spur of literary exile was tied in to their socialist or left-wing ideas. As noted by Mary Daly, in relation to migratory trends in the 30s, although the overwhelming majority left for economic reasons, emigration also provided an escape for misfits, veteran Republicans who could not adjust to the new state, disillusioned writers and intellectuals. So Daiken and Sayers are coming from a small community. They had other reasons to escape, literary ambitions not necessarily being regarded positively within the small Jewish community. Their desire to connect with broader internationalist ideas. And although they don't write about it overtly in the early correspondence, there is a background of anti-Semitism in 30s Ireland with a focus on the stereotype of the Bolshevik Jew. Daiken was 11 when the murders of two Jewish men took place in Dublin in a space of 2 weeks in October and November 1923. And the incident caused fear and no small measure of panic. And Daiken would later incorporate a version of these events into his radio play, The Circular Road, which was his paean of praise, or looking at the Jewish district of Dublin in the 20s. Although the victim in the play is caught in the crossfire, not shot deliberately as the actual victims were. So there are many factors which are pushing them to leave and to seek to try out their ambitions elsewhere. The negative attitudes around stereotypes of the Bolshevik Jew were a real concern for Jewish communal leaders. And in the Passover address in 1934, Chief Rabbi Isaac Herzog objected publicly to, and I quote, attempts to associate Jews with communism. In private correspondence with Archbishop Edward Byrne, he strongly deplored the anti-Jewish rhetoric of certain Irish Catholic publications, which cast Jews in the role of communist subversives. It's not clear from Daiken's letters or archive whether his decision to use the pseudonym Ned Kiernan, particularly when he was writing for Irish Republican publications, was a decision to use a sort of stereotypical Irish name to authenticate Republican credentials, or some anxiety about anti-Semitism. But he did write under that pseudonym his more political poetry and his more Irish-based political polemics. So this is the background to the exile journey for the writers, some of the push and pull factors, if you like, and they're going into a different cultural context. This idea being debated in a lot of the journals and magazines, particularly journals like Left Review, about the role of culture, literature and society in the 30s. And so they're arriving right smack in the middle of a very lively cultural ambience, where these debates about literature and society are taking place in lecture halls, in publications, periodicals, and just even in social settings. The writer Margot Heinemann recalled the atmosphere just in relation to intellectuals and the rise of Hitler. The impact of Hitler's coming to power on European intellectuals was immediate and profound. Some writers were fascinated or even attracted by this radical solution for what they saw as a corrupt, decadent civilization, but far more were repelled, angry, or frightened, especially after the ceremonial burning of books, the onslaught on decadent avant-garde art, the victimization of Jewish and progressive intellectuals, all in what was supposed to be one of the most advanced countries. But as well as describing the fear and dread and anxieties of writers and artists, Heinemann also wrote of this period when she was writing about the Left Review and its cultural contribution as possibilities of hope and a sense of purpose, which was heightened also by the involvement of writers in the Spanish Civil War, both as activists or those who actually went there. Daiken vividly evoked optimism in cultural circles of the era in an unpublished tribute to his friend Charlie Donnelly. And he talks about heroic days of dream and struggle in this unpublished tribute and recalled a frenetic time when life was one long continuum of agitprop and things were buzzing with optimism. So this is this tribute to Donnelly really is a snapshot of the vivid times, the frenetic activity, the involvement in little magazines, political meetings, talking of poetry, and as well as fear of the rise of fascism, there's also a sense of purpose. So the Irish writers are also, along with other writers in London, looking at literature and society and how their own writing might reflect this relationship, and contributing to little magazines, Irish Front, which was run by Daiken and Donnelly together, which was a political news sheet for Irish workers, or in the case of Donnelly, contributing to the Left Review. And the idea of the battle, the oppositions of fascism and communism, and the Irish were debating this in the London circles, as well as other left-wing groups they were involved with. So to come to Michael Sayers, who's in a different group, he's been encouraged by T.S. Eliot to write poetry, and in fact, as a very young, a 17-year-old, he sent the writer, the poet, answered him and gave him various forms of advice. This is even before he got him to write for the Criterion magazine. So in the summer of 1930, for instance, Eliot writes to Sayers, who's obviously told him his ideas and his ambitions, and he says, read as much as you can on any subject outside of poetry that interests you, but don't try to work your reading into your verse until it comes naturally of itself. Get all the fun out of life you decently and morally can in your own particular circumstances, and send me some more verses in 6 months' time, and then come and see me. So Sayers has a relationship with a very influential writer, but he's also with the Orwell circles, shares a flat with Orwell. They both are writing for the New English Weekly, and the biographer, one of the biographers of Orwell, alludes to the influence of Sayers and his social set on their new friend, George Orwell, and that they influence his leftward journey. Sayers was in a group around the Hampstead set as well, when he ends up sharing a flat with the critic Rainer Hempenstall and Orwell. And Hempenstall, in his memoir, Four Absentees, describes the very minutiae of the the grey miasma of the era, the rented rooms, and the discussions. And in fact, the two younger writers, thinking of Orwell as a nice old thing, but somewhat old-fashioned in his tastes, his penchant for Dickens, and they regard themselves as going with the avant-garde. Sayers was one of the first to, in a review of some of Orwell's writings, The Clergyman's Daughter and Burmese Days, to identify the sort of limpidity of Orwell's narrative and his clarity, and one of the first to put this in as a critical assessment. His observation on the transference of Orwell's prose heralded the beginning of many such acknowledgements. So these are the cultural circles. He is quite different from Daiken. He's much less involved with Irish Republicans, and then he goes to the States, and he then becomes involved in crusading investigative journalism against fascist groups. So Sayers and Daiken are both Irish Jewish writers in the 30s and 40s who are finding different ways of expressing their political and their ethnic identity, navigating complex identities as Jews on the left, doing them in the case of Daiken through trying to write a semi-autobiographical novel in the 30s, which extracts are printed in the Dublin magazine, and Sayers then taking on this very political work of anti-fascist investigations when he gets to America and becomes involved in magazines and bulletins which are investigating Axis infiltration into American groups. So they're both choosing very different routes to express their anti-fascist identities. And as I say, Daiken goes the autobiographical route, looking to write about the Irish Jewish community in what was supposed to have been a novel. And ironically, the more apolitical Sayers embarks on a highly politicized journalism, which results in books such as Sabotage, the Plot Against America, which fully identifies the different groups unmasking racist and fascist activities through his writings with Albert E. Kahn. So they both got a very different approach to how they would express Jewish identity as anti-fascist, and at the same time look to broaden, in the case of Daiken, broaden the knowledge that people would have of the Irish Jewish community. And Daiken began writing in the 30s, an attempt to write the Irish Jewish novel. He revisited ideas for the novel in a radio play, which he wrote started writing in the 50s, and was broadcast on the BBC and Radio Éireann in 1960 and 62. Encouraged by Samuel Beckett and the poet Austin Clarke, he returned to the idea of writing the Irish Jewish novel in the 60s. And at the time of his death, he had circulated a manuscript to a number of publishers. But he had received encouragement in writing from Samuel Beckett, who indeed suggested that he showed to his publisher, John Calder. So by the end of his life, this manuscript is unpublished. This is the response of one of the Oxford University Press editors who, although they admired it, felt that it wasn't able to be published. And of course, Sayers had the shadow of the blacklist, which had interrupted his career. And in the obituary, Gordon Boker refers to the fact that he was not bitter. He had endured the sidelining and the stop to his career, basically, with dignity and with some sense of humour. So the terrain, which opened up through the archives in the National Library, brought me to all sorts of different routes. But the 30s is a decade in Irish history which remains almost uncharted. And even one section of cultural history that I've tried to reveal here shows its fertile territory for exploration. And within the archives, it can be further explored by all the riches in the National Library. So I think I'll leave it there and see if people have any questions in relation. And thanks for the attention.
Katrina, somebody is wondering about Daiken's book, The Circular Road. Is it available to read, and where can I get it?
Well, if I get up a campaign to get it published, I might be able to. There is actually the script for the play is in the UCD archives. So the actual play that was broadcast first on the BBC. There's some excerpts in the National Library, but the full of it is with the family relatives, and it never got published. So there are drafts within some of the Daiken files in the National Library, not fully, but the radio script is available in UCD under the RTE archives. So as I say, until I get somebody, I think it would need an awful lot of editing. I mean, he worked on it for so long, and yet it's fits and starts. It's definitely got an historical, cultural significance. I mean, it would be great to hear the play again on the radio. So there's something that could be attempted, or it's the full script is there.
And somebody's wondering if there's a recording of the play.
I haven't heard it, but I'm assuming that there may well be in RTE archives. I've never heard it, okay. But I would say, well, it was 62, so I'm giving another job to the RTE archivist here.
And somebody's wondering, Katrina, what did Sayers do in later life?
Well, he when he came back, he was always doing under the years that he was in exile, in blacklist exile. Essentially, he was and this is his own assessment of it, churning out scripts for TV drama. So he wasn't able to come back. Like, he had very severe restrictions on his passport. And in fact, Conor Cruise O'Brien helped him. I mean, we are talking about the McCarthy era of the late 40s, 50s. This went on. So he could only write the TV dramas that he did under a false name, essentially, as many blacklisted writers did. And when he eventually came back to the States in the 1980s, obviously he was an older man at that point, and such were his circumstances that he got a sort of a charity flat within an apartment block that was run by the Theatre Guild, and you had to have under a certain level of income. I think it was $1,000 a year in order to qualify to get these flats. So he did a certain amount of teaching and lecturing, and he did write. He was one of the many writers who were on the film, the first version of Casino Royale, and on the DVD that you can still get, Michael Sayers is credited there as one of the writers for the screenplay. So he also did some script doctoring for Zorba the Greek. He did all sorts of jobs around rewrites, but he was on a road to be top TV drama guru, I suppose. He was on a pathway, and that was just curtailed. So he did manage, unlike some blacklisted writers, didn't even manage to get the sort of work that he got, but always under another name. And these bits of screenplays, again, he couldn't at the time get credit for it because of the blacklist, fears of directors. But he is, as I say, at least credited on Casino Royale, although it wasn't a successful film, but he has a modern credit for that.
Mm-hmm. And somebody would like to know, Katrina, do you know anything about Emil Slitovar? Perhaps not as well known.
I have to say I don't. No. So that in terms of, is this in terms of a friendship with Daiken, or in terms of being in those circles?
Yes, if Eilish would like to come back and just let us have some more information on that question, then I can pass it back to Katrina. Also, would Katrina comment on T.S. Eliot's known anti-Semitism in relation to his mentoring of Michael Sayers?
Oh, well, Sayers, let's put it this way. In the correspondence that I've read, and I haven't read all, if Sayers has just been encouraged by T.S. Eliot. Now, Sayers also got into quite extraordinary exchanges with Ezra Pound about his anti-Semitism. As far as I know, in the letters that I've seen of Sayers, he never took T.S. Eliot on in terms of the anti-Semitism in the poems, and he was a young and impressionable man who has been encouraged by him. So in any of the material that I saw, I didn't see any exchange where he challenged T.S. Eliot. That I don't, and I have talked to his son, Sean Sayers. He didn't raise any later disillusionment, shall we say. Now, in terms of archives, can I say that Michael Sayers' archive is recently gone to the Bodleian Library. So there's a massive material there. But of the letters which I saw, I didn't see evidence of Sayers becoming disillusioned with Eliot or challenging him necessarily. But he did challenge other writers, as I say, in Ezra Pound. Just writing letters objecting. So I've only seen one of those, but interesting that in the 30s period, he's so much more in mainstream cultural circles in London. And then there's this flip when he goes to America, and he suddenly becomes the very politicized investigative journalist looking at these shadowy Nazi groups or anybody associating, trying to promote anti-Semitism. So he has a sort of a flip from 1939 on. Obviously, like everything in life, it doesn't necessarily occur immediately, but it's very, very different work than he does when he goes to the States at first, given that he was doing, drama, mainstream drama criticism for the Criterion and New English Weekly, and wasn't bringing political messages or any interpretations mostly into that cultural criticism. And then he becomes so much more mobilized by the late 1930s, and working with Albert E. Kahn on these bulletins to expose espionage. So he has quite a few phases and changes in his attitude. It's hard not to see the war and the situation, obviously, in Europe as galvanizing him in another direction.
Now, that writer, that question, Katrina, was about, our questioner comes back to say that he was a Dublin Jewish writer, ex-Trinity, wrote a play called The Refugee, which was performed Peacock and heavily censored.
And what date? What?
There isn't a date, actually.
Okay. No, I'm just wondering what era. But there's thesis for somebody.
Yes, there's some more. Yeah, absolutely, some work for somebody to do. And there's a comment here, actually. I'm thrilled to be able to hear this presentation. When I was 10, I got a copy of Daiken's Children's Toys Through the Ages.
Yes.
Which, one way or another, led to my PhD dissertation, The Folk Games of Celtic-Speaking Children at the University of Pennsylvania.
That's fantastic. His last book was published with Dolman Press, and that was Out Goes She, and that was street rhymes. I mean, he was ahead of his time in trying to look at sort of sociological analysis of street rhymes as well as fun. But, I think at the same time, that's a whole separate strand, which I didn't go into. There is another book for somebody else to do about the whole side about street rhymes, toys. He was founder of a toy museum in the south of England. That's a whole other strand. Mm-hmm. And again, in the National Library Archives, there are boxes of the writings specifically about, in relation to folklore and all his interests, his book on lullabies, all of that's in there. So we'll get somebody else to do that.
That would be another talk. Another talk tonight.
Yes.
1942 actually is the date for that other question there.
Okay, all right. Well, that's amazing. And that was performed at the Peacock.
Peacock, yes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I've got my website, and you can ask me questions through the email there as well. People can if they want to, you'll find it. It's just katrinagoldstone.com. If there's other queries, so but
that's great, Katrina. I think we've done the comments. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, everybody, this evening. And thanks to Katrina. Oh, there's one more here. You also mentioned the poet Michael O'Brien, Katrina. Did he have an influence on these writers? Thank you for such an interesting talk.
So Thomas O'Brien, that's the book by Gustav Klaus. So he had the searing experience in the Spanish Civil War, and another of the writers in the book, Ewart Milne, was a medical courier. So he obviously had a body of poetry connected to his experiences in the Spanish Civil War, and of course the most well-known is Charles Donnelly. So Thomas O'Brien would be linked in with the Irish writers and poets who had direct experience of the Spanish Civil War and wrote about their experiences. So in terms of influence, it's that through that searing experience, we had Irish writers' literary responses with the likes of Thomas O'Brien and the better known now Charles Donnelly and Ewart Milne. So they would have known, they would have been linked through those experiences, and that's the way they're sort of interconnect.
Okay, thanks very much, Katrina. And as Katrina said, if you have any other queries, you can address them to our website, Katrina Goldstone.
Yeah.
.com. Yeah. Okay.
There's a form there. And listen, thank you for everybody at the National Library again, to Breach and Sandra and all the wonderful staff. And there are treasures which the library is now open for people to get, and archives to further, the 30s decade hope other people take on to explore that cultural and social history too. So thank you for this platform.
And thank you, Katrina. And actually, thanks. That were my last words I was going to say. If anybody's interested, look at our website, www.nli.ie, and look up the online catalogue there. You can find the papers that Katrina referred to in her talk and lots more besides. And the library and the reading rooms are open again. So just check the website for the opening times and how to access the material. And it's great to be back. And thank you all for joining us from wherever you joined us for this evening's talk. And thanks especially to Katrina for her wonderful talk. Thanks, everybody, and good night.